Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Thanks to Capital One, our sponsor here at South by Southwest, where we're doing podcasts live from the Capital One house at Antone's. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here in front of Antone's, home of Capital One House at South by Southwest. I'm here with Jared Smith of Capital One. We're talking about open source in a regulatory world, and I'm really curious on, Jared, on how you think about that. Really, perhaps what we can do is just start with the philosophies you've developed, and then we can look backwards at some of the processes and thinking that goes into what you really need to do when you're a big bank like Capital One. You're thinking about open sourcing your technology. Sure. So I think if you take a broad view of open source in a kind of regulated environment like banking, you have to find the balance between the freedom that open source gives you to use a lot of software that's already been developed and shared out there, and kind of balance that with your regulatory requirements, and just making sure that you're kind of buttoned down and well managed in the way that you keep track of things, have audit logs, have transparency into the process, and review for risk. So let's talk about that balance then, and how that balance works. So tell me a little bit about how you define establishing that balance. Sure. So one of the things that we've done at Capital One is to try to find what processes can we put in place that aren't too onerous on the part of the developers, but that make sure that we have some good controls in there. So what we've established is an open source office, and the purpose of that open source office is really just to be the intersection between our legal folks, between our security team, between our brand team and the developers, so that the developers have one place to come to kind of get some hand-holding through that process, and then our legal team and security team and brand team don't have to go out and deal with each developer individually. We kind of shepherd those projects through the process and through the the hand-holding to get the approvals they need to either use a particular piece of open source or contribute back to a particular piece of open source. So tell me about the people you have in the open source office. Who do they represent? What are the constituencies that they represent in the open source office? So the open source office works in our enterprise architecture team, and basically kind of shepherds things through the process. But we also have what we call our open source review board, and this is where we get together with our good friends in our legal department, our good friends in our security department, brand and platform, and a few other teams will show up from time to time there as well. And that's where we really review what are the things that people want to do with open source, whether it's on the intake side, things that they want to use. We want to make sure that we check and make sure those things are appropriate. Also the things that they want to contribute back to. Also, as we launch new projects, for example, we launched the hydrograph project yesterday. We had a long process working with legal, working with security, working with brand to make sure that we had everything in good order to be able to launch that as an open source project. So from kind of a hierarchical point of view, what are the bases you ultimately have to cover, that you're thinking about as you go through the review process? Because I imagine you almost like try to treat it like down to a granular level, right? So there's really three broad areas of risk that we worry about. We worry about legal risk. Typically that is on the copyright side with software licensing, but we also look at our patent portfolio and make sure that we're not putting our patent portfolio at risk through either our use or contribution back to open source. The second big area of risk is one of security risk. Are we either using things with known security vulnerabilities, or would our contributions back to another upstream project introduce security vulnerabilities into that code? And that kind of leads into the third big area of risk, which is reputational risk. Right. We don't want to do anything that puts the Capital One brand at risk. Right. So we try to make sure that we're as flexible as we can to let the developers do what they want while making sure that we minimize those three areas of risk. I see. So it's a nice balancing act. I see. So you must have licensing processes that you think about. I mean, I know that, for instance, hydrograph is a Apache 2.0, right? It is. And Is Apache 2.0 a standard for you, or do you have other licensing that you think about and have employed with other open source projects?
So on the licenses for things we use,
right.
we use a variety of licenses, everything from the very permissive licenses like the MIT license or the BSD license, all the way to things that are a little more or less permissive, a little more what we call the copyleft licenses like the GPL or the LGPL, and from what we contribute back to, we'll contribute back under whatever license the upstream project is licensed as. But for launching our own external projects, open source projects, we typically use the Apache 2.0 license. We figure that's a good balance between the permissiveness of the permissive licenses while still giving a little more protection to us if we need it for example, on the patent side. We give a patent grant with that Apache 2.0 license as well. So we feel it's a good middle ground from a licensing standpoint.
So you go through this process, like let's talk about hydrograph in particular. So hydrograph, started from a core set of problems that you face with, extraction, transformation, and loading the ETL of, multiple different data sources, and needing something that you could use that, would be different than what a DBA would use. Really,
right.
What hydrograph really is something for developers.
Correct.
To bring those disparate data sources together. So that was the problem, right? That was the problem you're trying to solve. Tell us about how then you approached it from that regulatory point of view to think about how you can make this an open source project.
So what we have, like I said, in our open source office, we have a form that a developer can fill out and say, hey, I've got this project that I'm starting. I want to make this an open source project eventually. And so we walk through them as they're developing their code to say, hey, when you're developing your software, think about this. If we're going to make this open source in the future, what do you need to worry about?
Right.
You need to worry about the licensing. You need to worry about your dependencies and what dependencies your application has on other open source applications, and what the licensing, restraints on those. As we talk about security, and we don't want to launch anything out there that's not secure, so we make sure that there's good software hygiene and good software development practices along the way. And then we also talk with them about the branding aspect of it. Are you going to choose a name? How do you choose a name that would resonate with developers? And then there's the piece of, we don't want to just throw the code over the wall when the project is done. We actually want to build a good open source, healthy open source community around that software. So what are steps we can do to help make sure that community is inviting? There's inviting for new developers that want to come in and help. Make sure we're responsive to issues and pull requests. Make sure there's communication venues where people can come and ask questions and get help and maybe figure out how they can contribute back. And then just try to bundle that all up together, and then find the right venue and the right spot to launch it as an open source project and get that marketing out there, for lack of a better term.
I'm curious about a hydrograph too, because it really gets into the whole world of data operations, really the diplomacy of data, because in some cases data may be you may want to make it fully available to to one constituency, but maybe not another, or maybe the data is fully available to different parties. And hydrograph is essentially kind of it's like a pipe system. It reminds me of like classic tools I used to use back in the day, like RSS, Yahoo pipes, right? But there's when you write Yahoo pipes, you can pull in any RSS feed, right?
That's right.
You could pull in any kind of data. So what is that almost like that diplomatic kind of process that you're thinking about when you're thinking about disparate data sources in the data ops kind of context?
Yeah, it's very much like go back to your Yahoo pipes analogy. It's taking these sources together and then adding particular logic around that, whether it's joining on different feeds, whether that's filtering, whether it's doing some sort of manipulation, changing date formats is a good example. And that's taking those and running those through that series of transformations in kind of an acyclical graph, and take multiple sources, run it through your transform layer, and then out to an end data source, whatever your data sink is. That's
pretty interesting.
It really is.
And so once the open source project gets launched, and then you get into actually the management of the project itself, what is the process that you follow? Once a project gets going.
So it's not so much as a checklist or a really tight process. It's just being very community minded and community focused. It's what practices can you put into place to make sure that people who are either users of your software or future developers of additions to your software, that they feel like it's a welcoming environment. So being responsive to their issues and pull requests, having communication venues where you can talk with them and share ideas, being very open to their input, even if at first glance you're like, oh, I'm not sure that's a good fit for my software. One of the keys of being a good open source community manager or an open source community member is learning not to say no, but learning to say yes when this happens, or yes if we can make this work, or yes if we can overcome this hurdle, rather than just saying, no, that doesn't sound like a good fit.
So every open source project has its maintainers. Do you guys work with internal and external maintainers on the project?
Absolutely.
Right.
We want to make sure that people can develop, on our software, whether they're a Capital One employee or not. So for example, some of our other open source projects, Cloud Custodian and Hygeia, we launched Cloud Custodian last year and Hygeia the year before that, and each of those has people contributing to the code from outside Capital One, and we value that, and they're valuable parts of our open source community.
So then how do you then think about the regulatory environment when you have external developers who are maintainers? I guess that's what you're really trying to button all up before the project goes out the door?
Some of that. I mean, for us, being well managed from a regulatory environment is just making sure we have the proper controls and reviews in place and good audit logs, so that if a regulator comes along and wants to know, where did this piece of code come from, when did it come into the software, why was it added, that we have those sorts of things. And that's good open source development practices gives you that already, whether it's git commit logs or those sorts of things. Good software development practices have these same sorts of things that regulators are looking for in order to build trust in your environment. So
it's really it's keeping really to the basics and making sure that it's following that those established practices that open source communities that have some sophistication have to follow.
That's right.
Anyway.
It's about communication and transparency and accountability at the end of the day.
Right. So what are the obstacles that you look for then? So like as you're kind of going down this road and trying to be as preventative as possible, what are those obstacles that you're looking at? I guess maybe if there's anything specifically around legal or security that you can mention that help gives people some context.
Sure. So I think the one thing that we pay particularly close attention to is the idea of contributor license agreements, or what are called CLAs. What we ask contributors to do, if they want to add a patch or a new feature to our software, that they sign a license to us to be able to use that software and incorporate it into our software. To take a step back, open source software in general, typically when you contribute back to an open source project, there's this implied license that you're giving your code back to that common pool of code. We just make that a little more formal with a contributor license agreement, just to make sure that we've got a good license to every piece of code we've got in our system. It's just a more explicit way of doing that rather than the implicit open source license.
So if a developer submits a pull request, they have to sign this contributor license agreement?
We ask them to sign this contributor license agreement, and they're not assigning copyright. They don't lose any of their other rights to do whatever they want with that code. It's just making sure that from our standpoint, we have a license to use and incorporate that code within our project.
Right, and it's something then you can track as an artifact, and can't you?
Correct.
Right.
The other thing we look for is we ask our project maintainers to just keep an extra eye on security. As pull requests come through, just do a little extra due diligence on those pull requests as they come in, to make sure that we're not introducing any new security vulnerabilities.
Funky.
That's right.
Right. Well, good. So, you've established these practices. What are some of the things you're thinking about how you can improve upon as you start offering more open source projects? Because as we well know, software is at the center of business. Increasingly, software is open source. So it's not like we're going to go recede, right? You're going to continue to have to do these things.
That's right.
Yeah. So I'm curious on those challenges you're thinking about and what you're looking at trying to make, to resolve.
I think the biggest challenge for me over the next year when it comes to our open source projects is just being able to scale how we train these project leaders to be good community managers and community leaders. We've launched about a dozen open source projects over the past year, and I anticipate we'll do at least that many this upcoming year, and that just means there's more work for me and my team to help make sure that we can train these software developers in good practices to be good open source citizens.
That's terrific. Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for taking some time to talk with me today.
No problem. It's always good to talk to you.
Your guys' open source in a regulated environment. It's always good to talk to you. I'll say it again. I just really enjoy coming to Austin and being part of the Capital One story, because you guys really do bring that whole kind of reality of the new stack really really make it tangible. And so thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to Capital One, our sponsor here at South by Southwest, where we're doing podcasts live from the Capital One house at Antone's.